I discovered I discovered that as a result, that like everywhere else in the country, we had 38% of our homeless youth identified as LGBT, which is pretty much about the average around the nation. And we had a law in Utah that said that you couldn't shelter a youth for longer than 8 hours without parental consent or emancipation. And 8 hours in the middle of winter is, when it's 10 degrees outside, it's not a lot of time to shelter youth. And I knew we didn't have an emancipation law because I'd worked in child welfare, and I knew we didn't have an emancipation law. So I wrote one on my dining room table. Now you got to remember that this is like pre-Google. It's not like I could like Google how many emancipation laws are there in the world. I couldn't do that. So I had to do a lot of groundwork. The Child Welfare League of America was very helpful. But I basically took 26 lines from 26 other states, put them all together in a document, and hand-picked the lines that I thought were best for Utah and would fit the culture of Utah. And I drafted that law, and because of my previous work, so here's a little nugget of advice. Don't ever burn a bridge because you never know who you're going to need. Because of my previous work, I was able to call a legislator who I was connected to and ask her to run the bill for me. And what happened was that I ended up teaching myself how a bill becomes a law. I taught myself how to become a lobbyist, and I lobbied on behalf of that bill, built a coalition, and got it passed 2 years later. So one of the things that I think is really impactful for all y'all who are doing social work is that one of the things that I learned, well, you should all know how a bill becomes a law because it's really important to know how things are funded and how things happen because it directly impacts our ability to do our work. But the other thing that I think is really important is that everything you learn in a social work program, whether it be a BSW or MSW program, every single thing you learn, it makes you uniquely suited to be an advocate and a lobbyist. And I really think that that's important for us to understand because we have so much power when we can understand how to infiltrate the systems. And as part of the system, I feel like we have not just an ethical obligation, but I really feel like we have the right to start to take back these spaces and really get involved in what's happening locally. We don't have a lot of power federally, and we're seeing that very clearly. The thing I said in the class that I guest lectured at Temple, and that I want to say to you all now, especially on the East Coast, is that we are watching in real life time entire systems collapse upon themselves. Our medical system is not going to survive this. Things are going to destroy themselves destructively. And I think social workers are really uniquely suited to look at what's happening and really figure out a way that we can really drill down into our communities to figure out how we're going to help people not just survive this, but thrive from this. And I think there's so much that we're going to see happen, especially where you all are, in the next 6 weeks to a couple of months, that by the end of the summer, this nation is not going to look anything like it did at the beginning of the year. And I think that social workers are actually really uniquely suited to figure out how we get through the carnage and the wreckage and figure out how to fix it. And it's because we have this ability to create community, create coalitions, to really get into how people operate, to figure out how to help people survive through this and really thrive from this. And so that's a little tangent, but I loved that work. And from that work with the Emancipation Law, I ended up on April 1st, 2006, the CEO of Planned Parenthood Utah called me and said, I understand I'd be a fool not to hire you. And I said, hire me for what? And she said, to be the vice president of public policy for Planned Parenthood of Utah. And I laughed because it was April Fool's Day, and I hung up on her. And I was like, that's a really good joke. And I hung up the phone. And then Carrie called me back again, and she said, Missy Bird, this is Carrie Galloway. And I was like, oh my God. Like, Carrie Galloway was this woman that I had held up in the highest esteem ever. And I never even met her personally until that phone call. And I was like, she's like, you just hung up on me. And I was like, oh my God, that's not a joke. Like, you're really calling me? And she said, yeah, I want to interview you for this position. the best part about it is that the woman who had held that position refused to hire me to be a community organizer for them like 2 years before. And now I was being called to take over her job, which made me really happy. So I got the job within like an hour. It was awesome. And it was one of those jobs that I was just, I was so excited. So basically I became the chief lobbyist for Planned Parenthood in Utah. And because of that work that I had done on the emancipation of a minor bill. So I think the thing that's really important to remember is that as social workers, you get those gut instincts, right? Like your instincts like, go this way, do this thing. And you're all wondering, why the hell am I doing this? Why am I even thinking about doing this? But it's because we are divinely assigned to do this work. It is our purpose in the world to engage in social work and social justice change. And it's in our blood and it's our bones and it's our marrow. And if I wouldn't have listened to any of those niggles, like those intuitive hits, I would not be where I am today. I would not have written that bill. I've written 6 bills. I've passed 6 pieces of legislation, all at a local level. You know, I understand how city, county, and state government works, and it makes me super dangerous and also really able to affect and help other people affect change at that local level. And if there's one thing we're seeing with this pandemic, it's that change isn't going to happen at the federal level. It's all going to be local. And so I just really want to just remind all of you that you have an opportunity as social workers to really change the way we operate in our communities. And I just really encourage you to think about that as you're moving through your work. And I also, one of the things I used to teach my students all the time was that this work that I've done, I have hit roadblocks every step of the way. Every step of the way. You don't lobby the Utah State Legislature about reproductive health and reproductive justice and not run into a whole lot of roadblocks. But I really managed to connect with people at the legislature, especially people who didn't agree with me, by using these lessons we learn in social work about approaching people from where they're at, not where we want them to be, about helping people see how the decisions that they make don't just affect themselves, they affect other people. Like, we are uniquely suited to have these conversations with people who may not necessarily agree with us. And I think there's an opportunity to bridge this polarized divide among conservatives and liberals and really think about how we connect with people in the middle and how we really can engage in conversations with people who don't necessarily agree with us, but help them to see how just switching language a little bit in community structure can change the entire way a community reacts or responds to a situation. And I think that was my favorite part of my job, was connecting with people who didn't agree with me and talking to them for 10 or 15 minutes and figuring out how to help them change their minds. All
Melissa,
of my, yeah.
can I ask a question? Or
Yes.
so I think that this is one of the really powerful pieces of the last discussion that we had, and it's come up in class this time. The Belly of the Beast paper was made some pretty strong advocacy statements, talked about war on women, and used language that was that was very liberal, right? And so there's a question like, how do you balance the, even as a social worker, that some people have strong positions about the right of a fetus, or all those things. So how do you talk to people about that? And when is it,
So,
when do you like hang the like war on women flag, and when do you not pull that one out?
well, you know your audience, that's for sure, right? It's the same thing as working with a client. Like, you're not going to go in with a client and start talking to them about all the things that are wrong with them. And you're not going to like go into a client with all of the solutions to their problems and be like, hey, here's all your solutions. Go ahead. Good luck. Like, you choose your words wisely, right? And you choose your messaging wisely. So there are some more conservative folks that I can actually use the term war on women, and they totally get it, even though they're conservative. But my favorite example of this is actually not from my time in the legislature, but from the work that I do now as a life coach and a public speaker. And every month for the last almost 2 years, I have gone live on Facebook with my friend Amy Wolf, who is conceivably the opposite of me. Amy and I met at a women's conference in Portland, Oregon. Amy is, I call her my conservative yin to my liberal yang. She is a very, very devoutly conservative Christian Republican, straight, white, suburban, wealthy woman. And when Amy and I first met, we friended each other on Facebook, and she actually tried to unfriend me numerous times because I was always posting positive things about Planned Parenthood, and she would try to unfriend me, and racism and sexism and homophobia and transphobia and, you know, all the things I posted about. And she would try and unfriend me repeatedly. And the way she says it, these are her words, not mine, God would tell her that she wasn't allowed to and that she couldn't. And because she had a lesson to learn from me. Well, what happened from that is that Amy and I decided to start going live on Facebook unscripted and talk about abortion, sex education, LGBT issues, guns, politics, religion, you name it, we've talked about it. And the goal was not to change each other's minds. And this is what I learned at the Utah State Legislature as an activist and a lobbyist. My goal was never to change people's minds about how they think at their core and their core values and their beliefs. My goal was to make an impact on our whole focus at the legislature was healthy moms make healthy babies. And so as long as we could keep moms healthy and help them be able to control their fertility so that they could have children when they were ready to have children and be able to afford their children, that was all the legislation we used. And that's the way I talked to Amy. Well, what has happened is that Amy has gone from being, in her words, anti-feminist and pro-life to identifying as a pro-life feminist who can now see that this broad sweeping legislation that effectively bans abortion also bans a woman's ability to receive medication when she's having a miscarriage. And it also makes it so that women who have miscarriages are being prosecuted for murder for a natural bodily experience that they have absolutely no control over. And what Amy has realized is that she can still be pro-life, but that the policies that are being implemented are actually not pro-life at all. They're very restrictive towards women. And it's not, I didn't say anything to Amy like, you have to change your mind. What I said to Amy was, think about this from your perspective, and let's see if there are places that we can come together. And the other thing I have always said, I said this at the Utah State Legislature, I've said it publicly online 100,000 times, I am not pro-abortion. I'm pro-choice. And there's a difference between those two things. I am an infertile woman who's been trying to get pregnant since I was 16. I would love to have a child, but I can't. And so my identification as being a pro-choice woman is not about being pro-abortion. It's about understanding that my body is the thing that brings life in or doesn't. And I want people to be able to make decisions with their doctors and their partners about what's in their best interests. And that's very different because I would not make that choice for myself. That's not my choice. But I think for some people it has to be their choice, and that's between them and their God, and I'm not in charge of that. And I think what happens in the policy world is we make decisions for people based on our own lived experience. And so, which tends to be, and someone actually said this, she put it so well today. I did an interview with a woman, Jamia Wilson, who's really awesome, and you all should totally know who she is. But what she said was, oh God, I'm gonna lose all my papers. She said something so amazing today. She said that ideas are not as important as people in power. And the ideas that we have in our head, sometimes we gaslight our own selves into keeping the power structures in place because of how they benefit us. And I think that's a really important thing to think about in social work, because social work does that all the time, especially for people of color and poor people. I remember when I was starting my MSW program, the judgments that I would make about my potential clients and who they were and what their experiences were. And I remember having this mindset in my early 20s of just such awful judgment against women who couldn't, quit using drugs and alcohol so they could keep their kids, or people who, abuse and neglect their children. But there's so many systems and so much oppression that works on and through people that I think that it's really important to remember that we have to take the entire system into account. And we can't do that by maintaining this idea that the war on women is an absolute truth in my mind, but that's not an absolute truth in everybody else's mind. And the purpose of my using that language in that article in particular, one is I was in a completely different space in 2014 than I am in 2020. So there's that, but also I think that if we look at it from a purely objective perspective and put aside being liberal or conservative, there is a war on women. And it's meant to keep us poor. It's meant to keep us in structures where the people who are in power can maintain their power. That's not just about the war on women. That's about structural racism and white supremacy. And that is the bigger conversation that I wish I would have had in that paper that I didn't have. And that is the thing that we really have to open our eyes to and think about. So the way I have that conversation with conservative people changes. The language is a little bit different, but my view about it never, ever goes away. It's always the same. So, I don't know if that helps or not, but it's all about the use of language.
You told a story about this, about working with somebody in the legislature, I think in Utah, where you collected some data about the cost of not using or providing contraceptive, and I just remember bits of that story and it being very powerful about how you crafted that approach.
Well, it's all about money. So incentives drive behavior. So whether or not reproductive justice is your jam or not, every single one of you who are sitting here with me right now has something that lights you on fire. There's a reason you want to go into social work, right? You have a thing that totally drives you and lights you on fire. And it might not be reproductive justice, but that's my jam. That's my thing, right? But the number one thing to remember, the best thing I ever learned, ever in my entire social work career, my entire career at all, is incentives drive behavior. And the number one incentive is always money. Always. Whether you're rich or poor, fat or skinny, smart or dumb, it doesn't matter your background. Money is the number one incentives drive behavior. It's Econ 101. So when it came to advocacy, and this is going to become very critical post-pandemic or current pandemic, and if money is the number one driver to people's behavior, which it is for the most part, if money is the number one driver, it's really important in advocacy to help people see how much money they're going to save or gain by engaging in policy that gets the state more money or less money, right? And so you can prove with birth control, for example, through the Title X Family Planning Program, which is constantly in trouble now, which, by the way, was started by Richard Nixon in the 70s, who was a conservative Republican man who started Title X to prevent abortion. So giving free and low-cost birth control was his number one strategy for preventing abortion, because he was not supportive of abortion. So for every $1 you spend on contraception, a state saves $10 to $14 in Medicaid costs, education costs, early education costs, prison costs, all of those costs. And so you can outline for a state how much money they're going to save in other expenditures if they just provide free or low-cost birth control to the people in the state. And so I used that a lot when I was doing my work, because it really, in a conservative state in particular, it really helps conservative legislators feel better about supporting prevention programs for contraception and STD testing and treatment, because it speaks to the conservative nature of saving money. And I think oftentimes when we talk about these things, we have to talk about it in those economic terms, which is why I really want social workers to also understand how budget happens. That's why I think it's so important to understand how policy is made, because without policy, there is no client. Like you don't have a client, and without advocacy, there's no client. Without the client, there is no advocacy. So it's directly related to itself, and we can't live without it. And everything, I'm telling you, this conversation we're having right now is going to be completely different in 4 to 6 weeks. And you know that because you're living in New York.
So how do you lobby? You just send somebody a letter that says like you should support this bill because it will save money.
Yeah, literally. So here's how you do it. So if you're advocating as yourself, you email your elected officials, city, county, state, federal, and you say, "Hi, I am your constituent," in the subject line, and then you introduce yourself. And you say, and it's really easy to find out who your elected officials are. You just Google it, and it all comes up, and you get all of their contact information, including their home address, which it's really fun to send your elected officials birthday cards. Nice little touch. But you send them an email and you introduce yourself and you tell them who you are and what your background is, and you say, these are the things that are most important to me. So if it's education, my husband's a disabled veteran, so for us it's just say, the VA benefits, education. I've got 3 kids, so education is important to us. LGBT issues are important to us because I'm bisexual. So, I tell my elected officials the things that are most important to us and our family. And, all of them respond because nobody ever introduces themselves. They only hear from people when they're mad, right? All elected officials only hear from people when they're mad. So if you email them to introduce yourself to them, they're like, wow, someone's being nice to me. And then when something happens, you have a direct line to your elected official. So my favorite, most recent example of this is that when we moved to Oregon, my daughter was new to her high school. She's a sophomore in high school. We were very mean parents, and it was a very terrible time for us to move her. I'm sure we're going to pay penance for it for like at least 10 more years. But she was bullied and sexually harassed, and like horribly, like pictures were taken of her body, like they were like sexually harassing her on Instagram. It was horrifying. And I had introduced myself to our elected officials. And so when that happened, the first thing I did was email our state senator and our representative and the principal and say, this is crap. You need to fix this. We have a problem. I can't prosecute these students because number 1, I don't know who they are. And number 2, I need the police to file a police report so I can get Facebook, who owns Instagram, by the way, get Facebook to take this page down. And there was a loophole in the state law that said that they couldn't do that. So Senator Gelser wrote a law and passed it into law a year later that helps teenagers who are being sexually and physically harassed at school prosecute. So it was easy, right? Because Senator Gelser already knew me. It wasn't that big of a deal for me to connect with her in that way. And so it's really important to let people know that you're doing social work in their community too. And these are the things that I'm seeing in my community. Like, you're not going to violate your client's HIPAA, right? But it's important to tell elected officials what you're experiencing as a social worker in your community, because they're passing laws all the time that are going to negatively impact the people that you work with, for sure. And they're going to negatively impact how we provide care as social workers in the community. And so it's really important to connect with your elected officials. And remember, they're just people. They put their pants on one leg at a time, just like everybody else. They have their own.
And you weren't joking about sending birthday cards. You really do that.
Oh, I really do that. Always. Even my federal elected officials always get birthday cards for me. And handwritten thank you notes. So if they meet with you, send them a handwritten thank you note afterwards. My thank you notes became legendary in Utah, because even if I got a 10-minute meeting, I'd write a handwritten thank you note and mail it the next day. So yeah, I mean, it's about connection. Lobbying is not about money, although money is handy. It's about connection, and it's about using your interpersonal skills as a social worker to connect with elected officials.
And you talked about like chasing people down for a coffee date or
Yeah. It's
meeting
way
people,
easier
showing
in
up
the
in
local,
offices.
it's way easier in your local politics. It's way, way easier to connect with your city, county, and your city and county elected officials are just as important as your state and federal elected officials, because they're the ones who get the CDBG funding for housing, right? That's county funding, that's city funding. So housing, education, your boards of education are critically important.
Those are
Um,
the CDBG is the Community
yeah,
Development Block
the block
Grant,
grant,
and city councils usually make decisions about how that money is spent, right?
city and county. Mhm. And there's so much funding that comes from that federal level, but it's made, the way those funds are distributed are all made at a city and county level. And so it's really the kids that you're working with, the elderly that you're working with, the tribal nations that you're working with, the people that you're working with are all directly impacted by city and county government. It's not, and school boards. You know, one of the biggest fights I got in about 3 weeks ago on Facebook was that I said, we have got to close the schools right now. And all my friends who've been friends with me for 20 years, my whole career in advocacy, are like, why, how dare you say that? The children are going to suffer. They're not going to have food. And my response was, I know this is a tough call, but either we're going to save these kids' lives and start to recognize that the way we feed our children is problematic, because it's not the school's responsibility, it's the entire community's responsibility. We have got to rethink about how children are fed in this nation. And we also have to stop a pandemic from spreading. And this is going to be hard. But this is where my social work skills actually kicked in. And I was like, let's have a different conversation. Let's figure out how we're going to fund the kids and feed the kids, for sure, especially the kids that aren't going to be safe at home. But in the meantime, we have to save the entire population from a pandemic. How are we going to have a different conversation about restructuring the way we feed our children in this nation?
So do
And let
you,
that system crumble and figure out how to feed our kids a different way, because it's not the school's responsibility. And maybe that's the conservative in me, but I really don't believe that this is okay. We have to find another way to help people access food. That's the bigger conversation we have to be having, not how can we keep the schools the only way people are fed. That's a problem, because if all the schools burn down and the entire system breaks, people still aren't going to get food.
so do you do this advocacy with politicians directly through social media too? Do you
No,
contact people through social media? No, you try to use more personal.
nope. Move on. Nobody looks at Move On. Nobody looks at change.org. None of those petitions work. It's all about personal interaction. It's all about picking up the phone and calling and saying, hi, I'm your constituent. Those are the key words. My name is Dr. Melissa Bird, and I am a constituent. I'm a constituent is the greatest thing you can ever say.
And then can you tell us what that goes like? You say that and then what?
They say hi. And they say, how can I help you? And you say, here's how you can help me. And they say, okay, well, that's not my job. Or, okay, I can totally help you with that. Because sometimes it's not. The mayors of our cities in the entire state of Oregon are figureheads only. They actually don't, their job is not to legislate. That's the city council's job. So everybody thinks the mayor can do something about homelessness, about, you know, whatever the problem is, and our mayor can't do anything. His whole entire job is to do proclamations. Every mayor in the state of Oregon's job is to just do proclamations and be the tie-breaking vote on city council. That's it. That's their only job. So understanding how those things work, and in some places, like in Utah, the mayors have all the powers in the city. So the mayor is more powerful than the city councils in all the cities in Utah. So it's different everywhere you go. So in New York, it's going to be totally different, right? The way your structure works in New York is totally different than it is on the West Coast. So understanding that, even if politics bores you to death and you just don't want to deal, it's so critical to being able to engage in one-on-one social work. So,
Can we see what questions students have?
oh yeah, please. I'd love that. I would really love that.
What do y'all want to know?
You can ask me anything. I'm an open book.
Hi, I'm curious about your experience in advocacy, and I can tell you're very passionate, and I really admire that. And I'm just curious what your experience has been throughout the years. It seems like more recently in politics, there's more polarity between the different sides, and it seems like nobody can come to a common ground. It's just a matter of I'm Republican, I'm Democrat, and it doesn't matter if you have um, like a beneficial common goal. It's just, well, I can't vote this way because that's not aligned with my party. So, how does that impact your role as a social worker and trying to really bridge that gap of these? It's not even a different belief, it's just almost like a hatred of each other. That's at least that's what it seems like for me.
I think that I think that it's not real. And if we walk into it with the assumption that that's a minority of people on the fringes of the general population, it sort of dismantles this myth that everybody hates each other and we're on opposing sides. So I really encourage you to think about this, not that we are in opposition, but that the majority of people, including myself, kind of mess around in the middle. So, we are not all, I have my friend Amy actually introduced me to this idea of being both and, right? So we're not all just one thing. One of my most favorite recent Twitter rants was that someone was just bagging on the Christians. And I was like, can't, not all, I hate to say not all Christians because the whole phrase is just so politicized, but really not all Christians. Like, not all Christians hate gay people. And so, or hate science. Like, the argument got into, you can't, because I'm a lay preacher for the Episcopal Church. I'm also a practicing witch. So that really got them. But I'm also a scientist who does research, right? Like, I'm all these different parts. And they were like these people who want to have the absolute conversation, they're not they're not sometimes they're not real people, truth be told, especially if it's online. They're actually bots, they're not real humans. But people who aren't willing to have that both and conversation are not your people. And so the people who are your people are the people who understand, number one, why you're going into social work, that you have an experience connecting with other human beings that is unique and different than everybody else, because you see how the system actually works on and through people daily, right? And so you have a leg up in that conversation. And I don't believe in my heart that Republicans never want to talk to Democrats and Democrats never want to talk to Republicans. I think there's a whole lot of us in the middle that vote back and forth all the time and that move back and forth all the time. You know, I'm not a big, huge fan of machine guns, but my husband has 3 of them, which is really unnerving, but he's a veteran. And so this is the one argument my husband and I get in all the time. But I'm supportive of the Second Amendment for things like handguns and other things. Like, I grew up in Utah, so I grew up hunting, right? That is not, that conversation in and of itself is super complicated. And we have to be willing to have the super complicated conversation, not an all or nothing conversation. And I truly believe that people are craving that. No one was more surprised than me when my most recent clients were Trump supporting women who say they can't find a voice, because my whole platform is helping people. My job when I coach is to help women find their voice. No one was more shocked than me when my most recent clients were Trump supporting women who didn't feel like they had a voice. I was like, whoo, you want to work with me? We're like, you're amazing. And I'm like, that's interesting. So, I mean, you have to be willing to talk to people who don't agree with you. And
It
you'll find,
seems like it's a lot easier to be us versus them online than when you're face to face with somebody, right?
but
Like,
people aren't naturally us versus them in person. They really aren't. They really aren't. The people will say things to you online that they would never say standing at your front door ever. And if you have family members and you have people that are, it's really easy. I know it doesn't seem easy, but it's really easy to shut them out. It really is. It's okay. You have permission. It's all right. Does that help, Caitlin?
Yes, it does. I really appreciate that. And I like you sharing how your background in some things that are seem like they're conflicting, but I think that really enriches your conversations with people because you can connect with people who may not even be in the same groups. And then I think that is really important to have those different perspectives. And it's something I'm trying to develop within myself. So I'm really encouraged by that. And it's good to hear too that it's not as bad in real life as what it seems online. I think for my own mental health, I've kind of not been keeping up with the news and politics because it just is so disheartening, like the political discourse, and everything seems so overwhelmingly negative. But I think what it really comes down to is that we're all human and we all we do want to make progress. So it's having those sometimes difficult conversations, but they are really important. So I do
They're
appreciate your
difficult and
feedback.
critical. Yes, they're
Mhm.
difficult and critical. And remember that the social media space isn't real life. The only reason I live in that space is because I do it for work. And because I like having a tantrum space, and my tantrum space is Twitter. Like it's my naughty space. I'm not the same person on Twitter that I am on Facebook at all. It's my naughty place. Who else has questions? Ask me anything.
So as somebody like throughout my bachelor's, a lot of my papers and research and even groups that I did were a lot on sexual education in schools and lack thereof, realistically. And even like my seminar paper, which was like 30 pages long, was about abortion rights for women. So I definitely align in that area significantly. But we found, there was a group I was in, and we found trying to advocate locally for like sexual education rights was just hard. It really, schools are not too keen on it because the federal government likes to pay them. Like,
Yeah.
how? I would love to fix that. Anywhere, in any one school.
So this is a great point because, this is a really great point. Sex ed in particular is super complicated. The last thing I tried to do before I left Utah was introduce a comprehensive sex ed bill, not with the hope of passing it, but with the hope of really starting a conversation about what is really happening in our schools in regards to sex education. So part of policy is not necessarily changing law or policy, it's having a conversation publicly about something that's controversial. So when I left Utah and moved to Southern California to go get my PhD, everybody thinks of California as this great liberal bastion of the world, but actually that's only in San Francisco and Los Angeles. Everywhere else outside of those two places is completely conservative. So when I did my research in a place called Imperial County, California. It was 9 miles from the Mexican border and 60 miles from Yuma, Arizona was the town where I was. And they had, their teen pregnancy rate was 53%. So over half of their teens by the time they were 16 were having babies. And it was not uncommon for them to have 2 or 3 children before they even made it out of high school. So it was like a third of the population was having babies, but 2 or 3 babies before they got out of high school. And one of the poorest, the only other county in the nation that has welfare rates that high is in Mississippi. So their unemployment, but they did $1 billion a year in agriculture. So most of the agriculture in California happens in Imperial County. Super conservative county, but because the state mandates state comprehensive sex education, they're supposed to teach that in their schools, and they don't. Clearly, they do not. Like, no way is that happening. And the Catholic Church was really prominent in their community because they were a mostly Hispanic community, you know, mostly immigrant laborers coming in and out working in the fields. And they would go back and forth across the border. So they'd live in Mexico and then come over to work back and forth it was a migrant population. But what was fascinating was that those schools refused to teach sex ed. So what we talked about from a policy perspective was, how do you change the school board so that at least half plus one were in favor of comprehensive sex education? Because they'd done that in another conservative county in California, and that's how they got the schools to start teaching sex ed. So this is, again, why I just really want to hone in that local politics is critical for policies such as comprehensive sex ed, because comprehensive sex ed doesn't teach everyone to have sex. It teaches everyone that abstinence is the best way to prevent an STD and an unintended pregnancy. But if you're going to have sex, here's how to protect yourself from those things, right? So school boards are key to sex ed, not the state, not the feds, not the state level, not the county level, school boards. So if you can impact your school board, or you can find people who are willing to run for school board, or you are willing to run for school board, then you get, and you only need half plus one. Because remember, for all of these positions, even up into the Senate, you need 2/3 of a house in the assembly, or the house, however you call your house. I don't remember if New York is an assembly or a house of representatives. But in your Senate, you only need half plus one. That's it. That's all you need. So on a school board, you need half plus one. On a city council, you need half plus one. On a county council, you need half plus one. So if you can get people to run, you're good.
So it seems practical, it seems like if I didn't know anything, I would go try to convince the principal that there's a good sex ed curriculum, but really trying to have maybe personal conversations with school board members to educate them, or supporting somebody's campaign who's more liberal on the school board would be a better technique.
Most school board members who support comprehensive sex ed actually aren't more liberal. They're more interested in helping kids not get pregnant. And they will just want to know that abstinence is going to be part of that conversation. So as long as you can prove to them that abstinence will be a major part of that conversation, most people who support comprehensive sex ed are neither liberal nor conservative. They just don't want kids to get pregnant. But no, not principals. Principals have to answer to everybody. Their job sucks. I can't even fathom being the principal of a high school. It would be so awful. Not only do you have to be around those hormones all the day, but you have to deal with all those parents all the day. And then you got to deal with the kids who are having so many societal problems and structural problems. No, those poor principals, they need a high five and a donut, but they don't need us coming at them about sex ed.
So then it's back to meeting people where they are. You don't go to the school board representative and say, we need comprehensive sex ed. You go to them and say, look, this is we have an embarrassing rate of teen pregnancy in our community. With
the STDs. It's all about the STDs, not even the pregnancy. Pregnancy is nice, but one of the things I did one year in the Utah State Legislature, because I had written a bill. So also know your audience. So in Utah, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the LDS Church, commonly known as Mormons, are the predominant religion in Utah, right? Well, in Utah, they believe in forever families. And the only way to get there to the celestial kingdom is to have a bevy of children. Well, in Utah, when I was working there, chlamydia and gonorrhea were rising at 4 times the national average, which is gross, just in and of itself. But chlamydia and gonorrhea, if left untreated, causes sexually transmitted diseases, causes infertility. So I went to the lobbyist for the LDS Church and I was like, Bill, we have a problem. And Bill was like, what's the problem? And I said, well, chlamydia and gonorrhea are rising at 4 times the national average. And he's like, oh, that's not our problem. And I was like, maybe, but if it's left untreated, you can't have forever families, and we're going to have a whole generation of people who can't get to the celestial kingdom, and I think that's a problem. And Bill was like, it's a tragedy. What do you need? And I said, $350,000 for the health department for testing and treatment. And he was like, done. And so he went to all the people I couldn't go to, and he's like, and this was in 2008. And so we're in the middle of a recession, and so nobody else got funded. except for the Department of Health got 350. It was the first time the word sex appeared in the Utah state budget for sexually transmitted disease testing and treatment. It was delightful. But I had, what we did was to prove the point is our fact sheets, we did chlamydia and gonorrhea rates for every legislator based on their district. And some of them, I was like, you would not catch me dead having unprotected sex in Tooele. I was like, this is disgusting. Like, this is horrifying. What is even happening? And then we bought this, no, Dakota, the stuffed animal. You have interrupted every Zoom call I've been on this morning. Hey, leave it. Katie, help. Sorry. I was on a Facebook Live earlier and she did the same damn thing. So they have those stuffed animal STDs. Like they have herpes and gonorrhea and chlamydia, and they look like little, they have organs too, like you can get a liver or a heart or a spleen, but they have these little organisms, stuffed animals, and we bought STDs for the entire Utah state legislature and gave the whole legislature STDs. It was beautiful. It was like the visual, it was the best visual ever. And they passed it. It was great.
And you got to say that you gave the whole legislature an STD.
It was the best interview of my life on KSL TV, the Mormon news station. I was like, I gave the whole legislature STDs. And by the way, their rates have plummeted since then because they started dealing with the issue. So, yeah.
More questions?
Rachel, I noticed you came on. Did you want to say something? Like you made your camera work. No, you're good?
Yeah, I have really bad allergies, so I was sparing everyone all of my theatrics over here, but you're amazing. You're like my spirit animal.
Does anybody else have any other questions? Anything? Come on. Nothing? You're like, we're so damn tired. We just want to.
Can you tell us more about what you do now?
Yes. So I run my own business. By the way, yes, social workers can run their own businesses. It's okay. My business is called Natural Born Rebel, and you can find me at naturalbornrebel.com. And there's a free book on there called Natural Born Rebel, and you can download it, and it's got journal prompts, and it's amazing. And it's something to do during your pandemic, so you can really explore your natural rebellion while you're in quarantine. So I started my business 3 years ago when I finished my PhD because I did not want to go into academia. I'm a really great life coach. I'm a really bad clinician. Like, I don't like rules. I don't ascribe to rules. So I was not the best therapist on the planet. Know your strengths, people. Know your strengths. Not a good clinician. Really great life coach. So I created a platform where I could use social media to help women really find their voice and tap into their passion and make a difference in their communities. So I teach women how to advocate for themselves and for their communities. And I love it. It's so great. I love my job. Every day I get to walk into my living room and go to work. It's delightful. I've written a couple books. One of them is on careers in social justice advocacy. And so you can find that for not very much money on the Amazon.com. It's a lovely little book about all the different sectors in social work and how you can get hired for those and get nice jobs. I do a lot of work online, so I have a YouTube channel, and you can get there from my website. And on my YouTube channel, I put all my Facebook Lives. I talk about imposter syndrome, do a lot of coaching. All my interviews with Amy are on there. So if you're interested in the work that Amy and I are doing, we actually have put out a manifesto for 2020 that's all about how we're going to engage and how we are going to be kind to each other throughout the year, and not let talking heads rule our lives. So that's been, she challenges, I'm the one who actually acts out on Twitter. And so she's like, is that really in line with what we've committed to doing, Missy? And I'm like, probably not. I'm not being very graceful, am I, Aim? So, and so I've got my book on my website, and then I'm in the middle of writing another book now called The Graceful Revolution that's all about engaging in graceful revolution in our communities. So that's what I do. And I'm on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at birdgirl1001. 1001 is my birthday. So
One of
in the card. But
one of the things that some of my colleagues and I have been talking about lately is, like, I like the metaphor that, like, the veil is thinner right now for changing policy because of these crumbling systems. I posted something on Twitter, just this list of things that we could never do until, oh my gosh, this happened, and now we can do that within a week,
Yeah.
expand unemployment benefits, or do telehealth, or use technologies that we've always been told that we're not allowed to use, or
Yep.
cross-state licensure, which we've been working on in social work for years and years. All of a sudden all the states
Yeah.
are going, like, it doesn't matter where you come from, just come help our people.
Yeah.
So how do we, especially if you're a MSW student, or like all of our students have BSW degrees, this is an advanced standing class, so they're all social workers already, and most of
Oh,
them,
you got it in your blood.
yeah, so they're there. So how do we take advantage of this thin veil right now to do something in our communities to say, like, okay, like, things are a little broken right now, and here's a better way? How
I
does
think
somebody
the
start if
number
they care?
the number one thing to do is to hone in on what lights you on fire, and don't listen to what anybody else tells you your fire should be. So while I understand that the crumbling environment that we live in and global warming is a problem, it is not the thing that flips my skirt and lights me on fire. Reproductive justice lights me on fire. Know your jam. If your jam is comprehensive sex ed, know that that is your thing. If it's education, if it's aging, if it's child welfare, if it's homelessness and housing, whatever it is, know that thing and do that thing. Become the expert in that thing, but also listen to your intuition. So I know this doesn't sound very policy, but it's very policy. Listen to your gut, because your gut, not your head will always lie to you. Your gut will lead you exactly down the path you need to be on. So when you have all these other voices saying, well, how are you going to make money doing that? You can be like, well, actually, I'm just gonna. I mean, look at Brene Brown, for Christ's sake. That woman has a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, and a PhD in social work. That woman is loaded. Like, if there's anything I admire about Brene Brown, it's that she has taught us there is no such thing as a poor social worker. No such thing. I love it. She's taken everything she's learned in social work and monetized the shit out of that. It's genius. Do that thing. Listen to your gut. Follow your instinct and tell your elected officials what lights you on fire and makes you feel excited. Because when you do that, they listen. When you do that, you are able to call. I have this crazy wonkadoodle idea for a bill that would help vets. So when veterans are, Hillary Clinton, back when she was a senator, made it so that veterans could buy into the TRICARE system, right? So as long as they were serving in the National Guard, if they'd served before in active duty military and they went into the National Guard, they could buy into TRICARE. Well, once you leave the National Guard, if you have not vested in your 20 years, you can't buy into TRICARE anymore. So I had this crazy idea, because my husband's a veteran, we need health insurance. We should be able to buy into TRICARE if we're, like, say 50% disabled and they've served over 10 years, we should be able to buy into TRICARE. Well, everybody thought I was just nuts in the head, but this is a thing that I think is really important, especially for reproductive health. So I called our senator in 2016. But so there are these things that light you up and make you feel excited. Those are the things. Go do those things. Tell your elected officials about those things. Talk about those things with the people that you love. Publicly pronounce them online that these are things that are important to you, and go do those things. Because you are correct. The policy veil is thin right now. And damn it, you can go make money. Do not think you have to be a poor social worker, because you do not. I think it's crap. There you go.
What if we're scared to say those things out loud, and we're not sure that the thing that we think that we're passionate about is really the thing, and it's scary?
It's not. If it's the thing that lights you on fire, it's the least scary thing there is.
But what if it's only the fire on the inside, and we're afraid of?
That's your head.
We're afraid of the fire outside.
That's your head. No.
Somebody will laugh at us.
Okay. I've been laughed at my whole damn life. I don't care. I've got 6 bills under my belt. Everybody laughed at me. That emancipation bill, everyone was like, there's no way you're going to get this passed in Utah. I was like, watch me. And for every person who said there's no way, I would go and find someone who'd be like, oh, that's a great idea. We should do that. Okay. It doesn't matter if people laugh at you. The bottom line at the end of the day is if you're living out your divine assignment, nobody else cares. You're doing what you're supposed to be doing on this earth. Go do it. People laugh at me every day. And they yell at me on Twitter all the time. And apparently you can't be a Christian and a scientist either. Who knew?
Has anybody worked up the nerve for another question yet?
Anyone?
We've talked about utilizing social work skills to connect with your representatives, and I really liked how you shared about how you write a birthday card and just introducing yourself. For someone who's just trying to start in advocacy, do you have any other little tips and tricks of how to make those connections?
Well, I mean, you just have to do it. It really is as simple as Googling who are my elected officials, putting your address in the box, and then finding out who they are and connecting with them. The one thing I will say is that when you're advocating and when you're engaging in that work, make sure that if an elected official asks you a question about something and you don't know the answer, admit that you don't know the answer. Say, I don't know, but I'll get back to you with that answer. Admit that you don't know, because you don't know everything, but you're going to know who to connect with. Or you could say, I don't know the answer to that, but I think John Smith will know the answer to that. Let me find out and get back to you, or let me connect you with that person and get back with you. So when you don't know, admit you don't know. And that's just life lesson 101. I actually learned that in my first job doing CASA training for court-appointed special advocates. I actually was young and not very smart in my ways of living. And someone asked me a really hard question and I didn't know the answer, but I was like, I think I was 23 or 20. It was like my first real big girl job, 24 or something. And I BS'd my way through the answer. And someone came up to me afterwards, one of my co-facilitators, and said, I'm going to give you a piece of advice that's going to serve you the rest of your life. If you don't know the answer, just admit you don't know the answer. And I was like, what? That's genius. I can do that? And it has served me so well. So it really, y'all can sit here and be as afraid if you want, or you can just go and do the thing. We don't have time. We don't have time. People are dying in your state a lot. We don't have time to mess about. And this is going to get worse before it gets better. And our clients, the people we serve in social work the most, are going to get the sickest. It's bad. You don't have time. You don't have time to mess around. You don't have time to be afraid. Fear is just your brain. It's not your heart. It's not your gut. It's not your divine assignment. It's not why you're here. Plus, if you need to get really pumped up, just watch my videos. You'll be fine. Read my blog. It's super entertaining.
I do have a question.
Yeah.
My husband's an active duty military member. How hard is it to work inside the military? Because you're talking about TRICARE, which is great. I've heard about it, but like that would be awesome, knowing that my husband might not do 20 years, but like it seems working within the military scope it's a lot different.
It is a lot different. I'm glad I never had to do it.
Yeah, I'm not looking forward to it.
Yeah, I'm glad
I just have to move every few years.
Yeah. I mean, but there are really ways to get military spouses involved and stuff. That's been the thing that I have been, I didn't have to do that when Jim was active duty because I wasn't married to him. I had to advocate for him when he was in the Guard, and now I have to advocate for him because he's got PTSD and all those sorts of fun things. But just find your spot. Find your spot. Find those women, because I know there's a lot of you out there that are silenced and don't have any control. You'll find it.
My husband was active duty and decided that he wanted out of the military. He had a 4-year contract, and we were in like year 3, and I went to grad school, and there was and there were several times, like, because I'm a little ornery too, that I went over somebody's head, that I called the sergeant's wife or talked to somebody above my husband, and he heard about it. There was a lot of like, you need to control your wife going on, and but they also like had to respond to some of those things, because like, okay, your wife did this and we're going to let you off this weekend to go do that thing that we told you that you can't do because your wife is raising a fuss, but you need to control your wife. So he got some of that, but usually there's some change involved. But I researched the hell out of policy and found this like hidden policy when we were trying to figure out how to get him out of his contract, that said that if your spouse is in grad school and you have a dependent child and the grad school is more than 100 miles from your duty station, then your contract can be ended if you don't have an active parenting plan. And we ended up like finding that policy, and I went to the chaplain and I said, here's the policy, and we don't have a parenting plan, and I'm away for graduate school, and we want out under this contract. And they gave him a lot of hell in those 2 months that he was out processing, but he got out of the military like right before they enacted stop loss in 9/11. And like I said, he got shit for it. He got extra PT duty some places along the line. But it's kind of the same, like working within that system and knowing, like I knew because of the military structure who was going to be an advocate and where that message had to come from throughout the chain of command for him to suffer less. Like if I had gone to the sergeant with that instead of the chaplain, the punishment would have been more severe, because there wouldn't have been somebody in the loop saying like, actually you can't do this, like you can't come down this hard or tell somebody no. There's a policy and we have to follow some policy here.
There's always a policy in the military.
There's also a lot of policies that say local sergeants or command people can change this policy, which is crap.
Yeah.
That's the one that gets you in the military. Well, this is what this says, the AR says, but it also says at the end that command can choose.
And that's part of why I brought somebody else into the loop, so that the commander just couldn't say, oh, we're not doing it that way, that somebody else is
Chaplains are great because they're officers.
So I think that really speaks to Melissa's message, though, that you have to know your system and how your system works, whether it's school board or city council or military command structure.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have so much as a question, but just kind of like, I want to thank you, because so I'm actually somewhat friends with a local delegate. I live here in West Virginia. Our daughters played lacrosse together, and he actually did remodeling in my house, and he won. And we're kind of opposite. He's more conservative. I'm a little left of center. And so I never really knew how to approach him about my passion. Like I'm very much about voting rights. And so West Virginia, it's conservative. They're wanting to move to voter ID, all of this stuff. So I've just found a way, like just listening to you, like my mind has been churning. All right, I need to approach him again, because we already know each other socially. Yeah. And, and so I'd never really thought, I've wanted to, but I'm like, how am I going to bridge that? Because, he's more, now it's funny because his daughters are very liberal. And so he's already open-minded to those views. So it's just, I want to thank you, because it really got my mind churning. Like, no, there's probably a good way to bridge that.
There's a good way to bridge that. And it's not about talking them out of voter ID. It's about presenting them with other options. So, and I have to say, like, I know that there's some rhetoric about how Republicans will lose if we go to permanent vote by mail, right? So that's like every Republican's biggest fear and argument against vote by mail is that they'll lose. But to me, that says more about who they're running for office than anything else, honestly. But presenting him with other options and talking to him about what he wants to see for why voting is important to him and why that's a core value, and how do we help other people have voting be a core value? Because I was raised that you vote when you turn 18. Like there was never a question. And it wasn't the men in my family that raised it. It was my grandma and my aunt and my mother that were like, you vote women died for you to have that right. You vote when you turn 18, no question. I was in college in Fairbanks, Alaska when I turned 18, and I got my absentee ballot before I even left Utah. Like, I knew how important it was. So, you know, the opposite of voter ID laws are permanent vote by mail, right? So in Oregon, when you move to Oregon, you get a ballot. Like, you get your ID, you get a ballot. That's how it works. So when we moved here, there's no polling locations here. It comes in the mail. You have a month to fill it out, and you have to get it in before election day. And every year we get a ballot in the mail every year. And so if it's a city race, you know, or the every 2-year races, we always have a ballot. So, and it actually saves the state more money. So also present more options, right? So this is how much the state of West Virginia could save if we tried these other things instead. And there's always arguments against voting by mail, but I'm telling you, and by the way, pay attention to this argument about defunding the post office, because if we defund the post office, people won't be able to vote. So that's a really critical piece here. People in the military who are overseas won't be able to vote either. So people who are in the military who are overseas who get a mail-in ballot won't be able to vote either. So that's always a nice argument, by the way. But pay attention in this new rhetoric about defunding the post office, because not only is that going to further alienate us during this pandemic, which, by the way, is not going to end anytime in the next 2 weeks, and it further alienates us from the people that we love, who, you know, we're mailing things to people, but also it directly impacts voting. And I think that's why it's ratcheting up in the rhetoric right now. And voting is a core value of Republican conservative people, just like it is liberal people. So I'm glad that helped. That's really cool. I look forward. You have to let me know how your conversation goes. And speaking of, you all can connect with me anytime. I'm really easy to find. You can email me through my website. You can follow me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Like, I'm really available, happy to mentor, happy to answer questions. I have lots of students that I talk to in classrooms like this who email me later and say, hey, I want to do this policy. Do you have any ideas? Can you help me strategize? So I'm happy to help anytime.
I think part of this message too is about social workers owning their power, and often we minimize the power that we have in all of our systems. And I think things like as simple as like Dixie right now is in a rehab facility and people weren't getting visits anymore, and she's like running around trying to source iPads and figure out how to get people connected virtually, and that's not something that her center has ever done, and she's just kind of taken it upon herself to figure out how to connect with people there in the center to do something about a thing that was a problem. And that's not changing legislative policy, but that's saying like something different needs to happen in this agency right now, and I am going to take it upon myself to do something proactive for the people that I work with. And then once you do that, that's now a thing that can be done. It's like, because this opportunity that we have right now during a pandemic, we can now think about how to make that like a permanent thing that can happen for the people who like might not otherwise get visits, or to make the visits more frequent. Or I think because like my advocacy work for foster youth who are in care, who are now getting virtual visits, who like a lot of the time have been told that like, oh, tech access is bad, you know, you're gonna, if you do these virtual connections with your friends or strangers, that's risky. But actually those are means of social support for young people, and I advocate for young people to have social support. So I'm going like, okay, now how can we get policies and practices that say we're actually supportive of youth having positive virtual connections, and what education and skills do we need to support them with so that they can do that in healthy ways, right? Or like a conversation we're having in the School of Social Work right now is like some students are super upset that graduation was canceled. And I'm like, I totally get that. That's it's heartbreaking and it's a loss. And how do we do that face to face? But also, we have a huge population of distance students, and not all of them can be at face to face graduation. And how do we do something equitable for all of our distance and online students? Like, how do we do virtual celebrations or involve them more in this thing that they also miss, that we don't talk about when it comes to uh, not having a graduation ceremony?
Mhm.
What are other things that you all want to change in your agencies, or what makes you tingle when Melissa was talking about, like, oh, what lights a fire in you?
I think one of my struggles is narrowing it down, because the more I learn, the more passionate I am about every single injustice there is. And I know some people have certain things that they're really drawn towards, and that's their life purpose, that's their calling. And for me, it's just I have a hard time choosing, but I do think it's important to choose that one thing, because then you can become the expert on it, and that makes it even more powerful. So I
So,
I don't know yet.
so for me, it's always been women and girls. So however I propel, so I've worked in child welfare, I've worked in advocacy, I've worked with delinquent youth, like I've worked in a bunch of, because that's social work, right? Like you can go to different spaces and different places. But at my core, it's women and girls. So that's why I love the reproductive justice framework, because it covers the expanse of that work. And so, and if you're engaging in true reproductive justice, you're engaging in intersectional um, frameworks that really address a bevy of issues. And so you may be one of those people who thinks that there's not one core thing, but there is. There always is. I don't do old people very well. That's not, even though I'm turning into an old people, I don't really do old people very well. I don't do teenagers. I do not. I mean, I have like 2.5 teenagers right now in my own house, and I do not do teenager. Adolescence is not my jam, right? Like, give me a 4-year-old, 3 to 4-year-old, I'm golden. Like preschoolers, yes, please. But like, so I know my strengths within that. So don't tell yourself you don't know what it is, because you do. You just, you can't help all the people. That's the other thing that, I mean, I would love to help all the people, but I can't help all the people. But what I can do is help people find out what their thing is, so they can go out and help people, right? So really hone in on what that thing is. For me, it's women and girls. For some people, it is old people. It is people who are aging. It is LGBT people. It is like, there's a thing that lights you on fire, Caitlin. I promise. It's a thing at the core. So focus on that being the thing, and make sure that everything, that all the actions you take, all the jobs you take, all the things you take out of that relate back to that foundational core. Does that make sense?
You've allowed yourself to have a variety of things, Melissa, from reproductive health to like veterans health to how do you identify the kind of that range and still, like, this is my thing?
I've tuned into my body. So I actually know when I'm getting distracted by the bright shiny thing. I actually feel nauseous. So if it makes me feel gross, that's not my jam. It's not my thing. It's a should. It's something I think I should do. So if it feels like a should and it makes my body feel nauseous, I don't do that thing. If it makes me feel terror-excited, which is a combination of terrified and excited, and I get tingly in my stomach, then that's the thing. But there's a difference between thinking, ugh, I guess I should do this because I'm trained to do it and I may as well do it, but it's not really the thing I want to do. Then don't do that. Do the thing that makes you feel terror-sided and just this edge of happy and joyful and ecstatic. And I promise you, there are jobs in social work that make you feel that way. You don't have to do the job because you think you should, or you have to, or because there's someone else who needs to fill that role. You don't have to fill that role. If you enjoy it, do it. If you don't, don't. And I learned that the hard way. I mean, I'm not going to lie, but it's the reason I quit teaching. I'm really good at it. I'm really good at teaching. My students loved me. I always had great reviews. I loved teaching to a point, but I hate grading, and I hate dealing with students who want an A over an A minus. And that was like the thing that put me over the edge. I was like, you don't get to complain about this. Honestly, you're not going on to get a PhD. It's going to be okay. Nobody cares. So that was the thing that put me over the edge. I was like, I'm not deriving joy. I derive joy from the act of teaching and conveying information. I do not derive joy from anything else that has to do with teaching. And I can't do this anymore. But what I had stopping me, and I'm sure many of you have had this conversation in your head, well, it's a good paycheck, or it's consistent income I can count on every month, right? For me, I was like, I don't care. And immediately I started making more money in my business because I was running a business and teaching than I ever did teaching. And so because I listened to that urgency that said, don't do that anymore. Let's do this. And for many of you, you're going to find in your agencies that something will make you feel excited, or you will do something with a client and you'll be like, wow, I bet I could replicate that with all my clients, right? The other thing to remember that just popped into my head that I want to convey to you all very quickly is that oftentimes in social work, we engaged in evidence-based practice because we're told that's what the agency does. But I would like to remind you that evidence-based practice is created by straight white men in an academic setting who have not been on the ground with people in probably 30 years. Evidence-based practice is made to keep institutions, the power structure in place. And so this is my little radical nudge for you. Ask your clients, what do you need? The next time you talk to your clients, what do you need? And then I want you to go to the people in charge of your agencies, and I want you to say, listen, I have an innovative practice idea. I think we could write a grant, an innovation grant, to try to do things based on our clients' needs, not what we assume they need, but what they actually need. And we can call it innovation. And you can write a grant for innovation, by the way. You can get lots and lots of money. See, so you got to say, we can find the money this way, and we're going to innovate the way we do practice. Because what evidence-based practice says we need is not based on what Black women in inner city New York need. It's not based on what farmers in rural America need. It's based on a majority of people and how you can blanketly fix people. And my favorite example of this is we've got a homeless guy here in Corvallis named Ray, and he's got this open wound on the top of his head because he has cancer, and it's horrifying. It's terrible. Nobody's ever nice to Ray but me. Ray's always sitting in front of the post office asking for money. So I go and sit next to Ray every time I see him. I'm like, how you doing, buddy? And he's like, I'm fine. I'm like, what do you need? Sometimes it's cigarettes, sometimes it's cash, sometimes it's booze. But the last time I sat next to Ray, I was like, what do you need? He goes, I need hot lasagna. And I was like, hot lasagna. And he's like, I need hot lasagna, Missy. And I'm like, okay, buddy, don't move. I'll be back. I go down the street to the spaghetti factory. I get the salad and the bread and the hot lasagna. I go back to the post office. Ray, of course, is gone. I'm driving around downtown Corvallis, screaming out my car, Ray! Finally, I see him, and he's like, starts sobbing. And I'm like, why are you crying, buddy? I got your food. And he said, nobody's ever asked me what I need. And if they did, and I told them, they never gave it to me. And I'm like, that's the problem with social work, right? We think we know best, and we don't. And we never ask our clients, what do you need? What would feel like love right now? How can I help you? because we have these rules and structure, these evidence-based practices that we think we're supposed to follow. But I think we can innovate social work and those evidence-based practices by starting to think outside of that box a little bit and asking people what they actually need. Because I assumed that Ray was going to tell me he needed a roof over his head. He needed a house. He needed to go get chemo treatment. No, he just wanted hot lasagna. And it's that simple. And we overcomplicate it, right? Like we have all these great systems and we're going to get people all this help. Really, it's just iPads in your center so that people can stay connected because they're so disconnected. Right? It's that simple. It's simple. It's not complicated.
And and we always talk about evidence-based practice. Like sometimes people get really stuck on what EBP is, and it's not this manualized treatment. It's a combination, like we talked about in our readings about EBP, it's a combination of what the client needs and what will work for the client and what the research says works and what you know as a clinician is going to be helpful in this particular case. And so we can
make me a naughty clinician.
so we can really turn that to the thing that our client needs most and what will work best for them, and still say like this is evidence-based practice based on what we know about what the client needs.
Yep, based on innovation.
So I'm doing all this policy work in North Dakota now. We have this big Indian child welfare grant where we are I'm working with these people from Native communities who are ornery about these issues of like, how do we get money for our communities? We're screwed all the time. By people who think that they know what's right for our communities. And we've done really innovative work in the community. And I have learned a lot, and I've been beaten down a little by people in these communities because I came in and I said, okay, the child welfare system works in such a way. How do we work within the confines of what the child welfare system says has to happen and make it work for the people in your community? And I got a lot of pushback from folks who said, like, the system does not work for us and we're not going to do it the way that they say that we have to do it. And I said, the child welfare bureaucracy moves really slow though, and we really can't change the rules about how everything happens. And they said, yeah, we're going to change the rules about how things happen. And I really had to let go of a lot of what I believed was true about systems and say, like, okay, this has to come from your power and you're on fire about this. And we have to use that fire for good and figure out how to make the system that you want for your folks an evidence-based practice so that we can support it under the funding structure that says we're only going to fund evidence-based practice. And so
you're bringing up a very critical point, Melanie, especially with Native American communities. And I just did an interview with an incredible woman named Lou Whitebear, who runs our Longhouse at Oregon State University. And she does a lot of decolonization research. And her research is all based in Indigenous communities. And if you want to see some phenomenal ways of restructuring under public health and systems work, Lou is doing cutting edge science about that, and all in Native communities. But the most critical thing that you said there is that we make this assumption that the bureaucracy, because of the way we fund things, that the bureaucratic structure has to stay that way. And I don't think it does. While the change moves slow, we have seen in the last 2 weeks that if there's enough will, there is a way. And we have spent our entire nation's history telling Native cultures and Native people exactly how things will go. And I'm glad you were able to let go of all of those ideas, because I think it is the place where we have failed most brutally in the social work field is with Native communities. And we need to be very prepared for the idea that they are going to be decimated by this pandemic because they don't have running water. they don't have hospitals, and they don't have structures in place. And our federal government is currently trying to take over a 300-acre nation in Chesapeake Bay, I think. I think it's in Chesapeake Bay, and completely annihilate those people.
It's
Now,
yeah, it's just systematically there.
Horrible.
It's just all the forces. I was in North Dakota during the pipeline protests, and it the 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 things that you heard on the news were devastating, but the things going on the ground, the local police were horrible to the Native people who were there, and the whole structure of how they routed the pipeline was all about protecting. They didn't want it to go through the city. In North Dakota, like, they didn't want it to go through the city of Bismarck. North Dakota is not a highly populated state. It's all completely rural. So they rerouted it through Bismarck, which, the whole state of North Dakota is 600,000 people. Bismarck is like an urban area of like 50,000 people, right? So they routed it through the Indian Territory so that it wasn't too close to the city. And so instead, we're just going to run over the whole like native lands that have been disseminated by the community slowly over many, many years. There's major distrust between political systems
As well,
in
there
this
should be.
state.
And
And
it should be that way.
yeah,
We've
there are
never done anything to the contrary.
there are tons of good reasons to be distrustful. So I'm there trying to help the city, states, counties do this work around improving outcomes for Native children who are way overrepresented in the child welfare foster care system. But the major reason for all these children in state custody is related to relationships between tribal and state people, and we're trying to address those things in the midst of these like pipeline issues happening. And it's really hard to bring people together, and the only way to do that is to convince white people, the people in charge in county systems, to turn over some power to the Native tribes so that they can take care of their own children. And there's a lot of resistance to doing that. There's all kinds of values about what makes a good family, and
Well, that's why I think it's really important to understand how we decolonize, how we have this conversation. And that's why I think Lou's research is like the way Lou talks in that interview I did with her. I mean, it's on my YouTube channel.
Did you? I was just going to ask if there's a. Okay.
All of you should watch it. We don't get to, as white people, we don't get to tell Native people what is appropriate and what isn't. And I think that's shifting. And I think it's going to be critical, because literally there's a tribe here in Oregon that hasn't had running water as long as Flint hasn't had running water. So, I mean, no water. We've stolen, not only that, but we've stolen their water. So it's not just that they don't have water. It's that the entire state of Oregon has stolen their water. So it's not like Flint, where we knew something was bad, which is still bad, by the way, because they still don't have water. P.S. Still don't have water. So it's bad in Flint, but we're talking about people who were here way before we were here, who literally we've stolen their water. So we stole their land, now we've stolen their water. And that's happening everywhere around the country. So I think that, we could go down a big, huge rabbit hole. The bottom line is, it's really important to understand how our social work structures are embedded in racism, sexism, and all sorts of other institutional crap in order to keep people in power. That's just how our entire system works. And so it's your job as future social workers to really think about how you can infiltrate those membranes of power and shift the way people think about what is needed, and how we translate what we've learned to actual practice and advocacy in our communities.
and even let go a little bit of what we think is most needed for people. Just
Let go a lot of it.
something that
I don't know what's really important. Like, I don't know what's best for Alicia and Rachel and Liz, for any of you. I don't know what's best for you. I know what's best for me. I can give you really great advice, but the bottom line at the end of the day is you're the ones who have to go and take that. And it's exactly the same thing with our clients. We can give them hope and love and all the things, but at the end of the day, they got to do what's best for them.
I have a question.
Yes.
So you guys mentioned social media as like a place where you rant, and I see that happen a lot. And then you guys brought up Flint, and most people would have never even heard about Flint had it not been for like technology and social media. So do you feel like that's something that we can use as a tool that people in power will take seriously or not? And how should we?
I think it's a tool, but I don't think it's the only tool. So I think it's a tool in your toolbox. I think some people in power will take it seriously, but I think most people, again, it's that connection. So one of the ways that it can be effective is to get people pumped up, but give them the ability to personally tell their story to their elected official. So in the context of using social media, it can be used as a tool to inform massive amounts of people about things that are happening. But the way you leverage it is to also give them the ability to tell their elected official their story, because the change that happens is when you help those people say, here, Joe Smith is their elected official. Here's how you connect with Joe Smith to tell them your story about why you want clean water, right? Or why you want access to birth control, or why you want a housing complex built in your neighborhood so that homeless people can have some place to live, right? Why do you want affordable housing? Whatever it is, so that people can get their information from social media, but they are given the tool to connect to their elected officials to make the change that is necessary. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
I mean, and Twitter's, yeah, I mean, social media is social media.
It's just a thing. But yeah, because I noticed like, like AOC, for example, she's very social media savvy, and she used that really to bring a lot of attention to her platform and to her beliefs.
Sure.
But I also see like a lot of like, because there's like so much misinformation, it's like we're fighting against so many different facets and letting people see like true issues that are going on. So I don't really even know how to even fight against that.
Well, I think what's most important is that we encourage people to tell their actual lived experience, not what we assume their experience is. And so if you're really, the thing that I think makes advocacy powerful is for elected officials to hear actual stories. When I was working at the Utah State Legislature, we had a bill come up where they were going to, and of course they've passed it this last year, but they were going to define personhood as a means of banning second trimester abortion or late trimester abortion. And they were defining personhood as the minute a sperm and an egg connect together in a person is formed, right? So and the first thing was that it's actually written in the Book of Mormon that that's not when a person happens at quickening, not at fertilization. So it was actually in the Mormon doctrine that that's not when it happens. The spirit doesn't enter the body until quickening, and that's how you know the spirits entered the body. It's fascinating. So there was one way that I totally used doctrine to kill the bill, because the majority of people in the legislature were Mormon. But what happened was there was a LDS woman who called me one day at my office and said, I'm really afraid about this bill, that it might kill me, because I have a rare anomaly where and she wanted a big family. Like her whole dream had been to have like 13 children, I think was her dream. And she could get pregnant, but at about the 5th or 6th month, her body would effectively kill the fetus, and she would have to get an abortion because the baby wouldn't completely die inside of her and it wouldn't miscarry. And so there was a rare abortion procedure she had to get in order to save her own life, because her body would start to reject her own body. It was horrifying. I can't remember what it's called. It was terrible. And she had had multiple abortion procedures, and they were trying to ban that particular procedure with that bill. And we ended up using her story. So she went up to the legislature to talk to elected officials personally about her own story. But she also started a social media campaign where she publicly came out on Facebook to her friends and family about this issue in order for them to connect with their elected officials throughout the state to tell them not to vote for it. And that's how we killed the bill, because she used her social media personally to tell her story, tell people how to get in touch with their elected officials so that she could start that sort of pipeline. So it can be used very well. I think the problem, it's not, Twitter is not even AOC doesn't, her backlash on Twitter is huge. So she may be savvy, but her backlash is gigantic. So I think there are other platforms that use social media really effectively. I don't think Twitter is effective. I think Twitter is a giant.
Yeah, it's
why
like
I
a
say
sinkhole. It's like so much hate
I
on
love it
there.
though. I love Twitter because
You
it's
can
my
you can
place
argue
where I throw a
endlessly on
tantrum,
Twitter.
right?
It's
But
so much.
Facebook I leverage completely differently. Facebook, the way I leverage Facebook is totally different than the way I leverage Twitter.
I have a really tight social community on Twitter, and we use, like, we're not like in the big Twitter of politics and all that stuff, but there's like a pretty tight network of social work scholars, especially people who are interested in using technology in research. And I've met people there that I've ended up collaborating with, writing with, becoming very good friends with. And so I'd say there are a lot of different ways to use a space like Twitter. And
yeah, and the feminists that I've met on there are really, I mean, I've connected with people on Twitter that I've ended up meeting in real life. It's also a great way to get jobs. I've gotten a lot of speaking gigs from Twitter, a ton of speaking gigs from Twitter. And I know that there is a core group of social workers on there, social workers and feminists and activists, that if you're really interested in connecting with organizations and people all over the country that are doing the work that you're interested in, Twitter's a great space for that. So it can be leveraged. It's just also a good place to throw a tantrum.
in some ways it has a real democratizing effect, because there's like you can be a student and connect with a dean of the school, or people who hold some kind of social power. People just like answer your questions and talk to you, and it's easy
really weird
to connect with people that you wouldn't normally connect because they're not in your kind of social circle. So it's a cool thing.
It is a cool thing. I love it.
Any last questions? We're right at about wrap-up time, and we've had a good 2-hour conversation here.
So thank you all for your time.
Is anybody ready to get out birthday cards to for their elected officials, or drop some notes?
Make sure you drop notes, and if you need any help with anything, just let me know.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Yep, let's say thank you to Melissa. It's been a good talk.
Thank you, Melissa.
Thank you.
Take care. Good luck, y'all.
Thank you. Really appreciate it. Dr. Bird, thank you for coming back, and I'll reshare your website information in our message board.
Okay.
Appreciate it.
Bye.
Good night. Bye. Bye.
Good talk. Are you a little fired up?
Yeah.
A little bit? Okay. Well, thank you all for being here. I'm going to stop the recording. Let me see. Stop recording. Before we formally